I would like to start by thanking the Pitt Center for Philosophy of Science for collaborating with us on this project. As Nick said, I'm an alum of the University of Pittsburgh. I did my PhD in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and I was very much looking forward when this was planned as a live in-person seminar. I was very much looking forward to returning to Pittsburgh, but alas, it was not to be, as we all know. So I hope there will be another occasion in the not too distant future. So for now, at least, we have maybe a wider audience for these events, and I'm happy about that. So thank you very much to Pitt for collaborating with us. Now, today's talk will be, in some sense, a continuation of the theme that Nick has started last week. I will be talking about laws in theories in which there is no space and time. In a way, it's going to be more philosophical than it was last week. I'm going to be talking or ending up at the following conclusion. Sorry, there we go. I'm going to be questioning the compatibility of Humeanism and naturalism as a result of this. But I hope you will see along the way how it nevertheless fits into the seminar series and the topic of our series to hear. The question that I will be ending up asking is whether Humeanism or a Humean approach to laws of nature will be compatible with a naturalist approach. More specifically, can one be Humean about laws of nature and a naturalist who takes fundamental physics seriously? And we will end up with something like defending the following thesis, looking at physical theories beyond the empirically established quantum physics and relativity suggests that there is a novel and deeper challenge from naturalism than those that have been debated before. The principal problem that arises is how to even articulate in a way the Humean account of laws in a world that's fundamentally non-spatiotemporal. So you can already see that this is going to be rather philosophical, but it's it really work in the intersection of much of my work, much of my work is between metaphysics and core philosophy, including increasingly epistemology, and of course physics. Okay, but let's get started. You might, well, maybe not the audience in this kind of seminar series, but generally one might think, as with Larry Sklar, that what could possibly constitute a more essential, a more ineliminable component of our conceptual framework than that ordering of phenomena which places them in space and time. As Nick has presented last week, there's of course the famous Aristotelian criterion for existence, according to which to be is to be in space and time. So, of course, we could imagine worlds to be in any sorts of ways very, very different from our world, but a world not in time, a world not spatial, except to some Platonist. Sklar supposes such a world seems devoid of real being altogether, which, of course, if you have this Aristotelian criterion, follows immediately that there cannot be any existence if there's no space and time. But of course, as many of you are aware by now, and as Nick and I have discussed in many of our past publications, but also in a book which is under contract and we hope to get out soon, where there's a more detailed discussion of how space-time disappears in different approaches to quantum gravity. So many approaches at formulating a theory of quantum gravity, they either presuppose or in some way entail that fundamentally there's neither space nor time. Of course, that denial comes in degrees and also qualitatively differs from approach to approach. But one thing that we typically find is the encapsulated in the way physicists speak about phenomena, namely that space-time theories such as GR are merely effective theories as opposed to fundamental theories, and the space-time itself that is postulated by GR as something that exists, whether we have a substantivalist or a relationalist picture here, doesn't matter so much, but that structure itself is emergent. Very much like thermodynamics is an effective theory and temperature is emergent. Okay. In general, that means the emergence of space-time is physically contingent in the sense that it may fail to come about under some specific circumstances. So there has to be some sort of confluence of the way the fundamental degrees of freedom interact that has to be just right for there to be space and time. So Daniele Oriti in forthcoming work distinguishes actually 4 levels of space-time emergence. The first level is consists in both general relativistic space-time, which in some sense you already have some typical properties or aspects of space and time that are absent or are reduced in some sense, and he includes at that level the quantization of geometric degrees of freedom. And as an analog, you can think of this as my attempt of showing something like a liquid flowing according to the dynamical equations, the Navier-Stokes equations, giving the dynamics, the hydrodynamical equations and laws, of course, that we have. Okay, at that level. In order to sort of get back the full space-time if necessary, you need to maybe take the classical limit if you have a quantization of geometric degrees of freedom. Now, maybe, you could argue that these are already in a way 2 distinct levels, but let's not worry too much about that. At the next level, 1 level up, you come to theories according to which the fundamental degrees of freedom are no longer geometrical or straightforwardly spatiotemporal. Rather, you find combinatorial structures, algebraic structures are described by algebraic relationships. And something like this happens when you look at the hydrodynamical analog, where if you zoom into the hydrodynamics, the fluid dynamics, you get to the molecular structure of the liquid, which is rather different, has rather different degrees of freedom. Now, to get from this back to the more fundamental level, you have to take the continuum limit, which is in general not the same thing as a classical limit. Moving 1 step further up even, we see that these fundamental degrees of freedom, non-geometric fundamental degrees of freedom, can be in different phases. Just like a liquid can be a gaseous, this is supposed to represent a gaseous state, the gas, this is a liquid, this is a solid state. Just like that, the fundamental degrees of freedom can be in different phases, only some of which are geometric or sort of have spatiotemporal features as emergent at some level of coarse graining. Here the challenge is to show that there exists a sort of a phase of that structure of these fundamental degrees of freedom, which is spatiotemporal. And then finally, at the final stage, you can have phase transitions. Nick talked about this last week, phase transitions, a sort of a geometrogenesis from a phase which is non-geometrical to a phase which is. Okay, so I mean, this is just to give you an idea of the different degrees you could have in the disappearance of space-time and the distance in a sort of a conceptual sense it would take to see it re-emerge. Of course, to discuss questions like this has been a long-standing interest of Nick and myself in our project Beyond Spacetime, where we study this. What I'm going to present today will be part of a project with Vincent Lam, more specifically, trying to work out the implications of such a partial or complete absence of space-time for analysis of laws of nature. So what are laws of nature? So if you're a philosopher, maybe you should stop listening for the next 2 slides because you will not learn anything new. But just so that everybody's on the same page, in philosophy, we distinguish between broadly two different families of approaches of understanding laws of nature. One is the Humean family, named after David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, empiricist, and the other family you could call non-Humean. And in some sense, to a first degree of approximation, you can think of the two different approaches as sort of representing different directions in which to think about the relationship between laws of nature, which describe or encode, in some sense, the regularities we find in the occurrent facts. That is, the facts in our apparent world. Now, for a Humean, it is the facts, the particular matters of fact, which are more fundamental and which are prior to the laws of nature, and they determine by some procedure of determining the laws of nature, which in turn are merely summarizing the regularities and the pattern that we find in the occurrent facts. In a non-Humean approach, that is flipped around. It's the laws of nature which are considered more fundamental and prior, and it's those that govern or determine in some sense, maybe together with some sort of initial conditions or some additional information, what the occurrent facts in space-time are. And it is these facts that have to somehow obey the laws of nature, or observe the laws of nature. Now, for a Humean approach, where the central idea is that we start out from the facts and we have no necessary connections between distinct entities, the one approach that I'm going to discuss, which is by far the most popular in this camp, is that of the best systems analysis. According to the best systems analysis, what there is really a mosaic, a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact. For instance, we could think of this as a distribution of point particles in space-time and the particular properties that they exemplify, being at this and that point or having such and such a trajectory. In the non-Humean camp, which is you can call the governing conception, as it's sometimes called, so that the conception which starts out from laws is more fundamental. In our project, we're going to discuss two approaches, one called primitivism and the other one dispositionalism. What there is, according to these two approaches, is similar, but importantly different. So they both start out from local matters of fact, such as initial configurations of particles in space-time, but they don't presuppose the full four-dimensional mosaic, but usually just a three-dimensional snapshot of the situation in the world, including all particular matters of fact. And then to that, the primitivist adds the laws, which are then such that they help project the situation in this snapshot that we took as initial input to tell us for all times what the exact configuration of particles, for instance, is. In dispositionalism, we don't add laws, but we add dispositions, which are properties which inhere in objects. So it's objects, they have these properties of behaving in certain ways, under certain circumstances. So these are properties which have triggering conditions under which they manifest a certain behavior. I'm not going to go any more deeply into these approaches today, but in both cases, there's some form of primitive modality that is presupposed. Either it's the laws which are primitively assumed, or it's the dispositions which do the governing in some sense. Okay, for that approach which I'm going to look at today, laws are considered the axioms or theorems of the best description of that mosaic. That is usually considered something like the theory that best balances simplicity in expression with explanatory strength or informativeness. Okay, good. Now, in a space-timeless world, in a world where we don't have space-time, and by the way, you know, I put here in purple space-time because in some way or other, it's always, space-time always comes in the formulation of what there is or what the laws are quite directly, sometimes only indirectly, but it's always presupposed at level zero, at the fundamental level in all these approaches. So there's a question how these approaches fare in any in view of any of the results from quantum gravity, according to which space-time is not fundamental, and it only exists contingently. So let me be very clear here. This is in some sense, speculative work, of course, because none of the quantum theories of gravity are scientifically established in any way. So for now, I will proceed by presupposing, I'm offering a presupposition that something like this non-spatiotemporality will be borne out by our ultimate best physics. Of course, this can be completely wrong, but let's suppose it isn't, and let's see where we get. So the question is a Humean analysis of laws of nature viable in such a world which is not fundamentally spatiotemporal? And to see that how it gets into the base level, we have to understand an important ingredient of the best systems analysis of a Humean approach, which is something like the idea that there are the facts fundamentally and the laws supervene on that. This is expressed in the thesis of Humean supervenience by David Lewis, for instance. And the idea here is that all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing after another. So maybe there's geometry, that's assumed fundamentally, there's geometry, a system of external relations of spatiotemporal distance between points, so that's in their ground level. Points of space-time itself, maybe, he's not so sure about that, maybe point-sized bits of matter or ether or fields or both. And to those points, we have local qualities, which are in the Lewisian idiom, perfectly natural intrinsic properties which need nothing bigger than a point at which to be instantiated. For short, what we have is an arrangement of qualities, and that is all, or a mosaic. There's no difference without difference in the arrangement of qualities. All else supervenes on that, and importantly for us, laws supervene on that mosaic. So the supervenience space contains only local facts, which of course are non-nomic in the sense that they're not facts which express some sort of lawful connection or pattern, but only particular facts, non-nomic, non-modal facts, and we have spatiotemporal relations, which are those relations which weave these facts into a carpet or into a mosaic if you want. So the basic occurrent facts metaphysically precede modal and nomic facts. That's the idea. It's a little bit like in a pointillist image. I like this analogy because here the idea is that the boat, for instance, or the galloc here, the trees, everything you see on that picture is really supervenes on the local fundamental intrinsic properties here captured by colored properties of the different points on the canvas. So there couldn't be a difference in the boat, say, in the state of the boat, without there being some difference in the colored dots that are used to make up the boat. But of course, there could be some differences below. Here, some of the points could be slightly different without a change in the sort of the macroscopic state of the boat. Okay, good. Now, I have in other work already argued that theories suggest radical changes, not just to laws of nature, as I'm going to argue today, but in the way we understand modality. And in particular, Lewis's approach, which is famous for including, so he's a modal realist, meaning that all non-actual possible worlds are metaphysically possible for him, and all those which are metaphysically possible are real. But they all have space-time, and spatiotemporal relations are those relations which unify and isolate a world. But if you don't have these relations as fundamental relations, then of course the approach is in trouble. And in particular, on his account then, if that's borne out, then our world comes out as metaphysically impossible, which I take to be a reductio ad absurdum. So, but that was with Lewis's approach to modality specifically. Let's now look at what the problems are with understanding laws of nature according to this Humean vision. Now, one problem that's been identified long ago, and many people have discussed this, is that there's an apparent incompatibility of Humean supervenience with quantum non-locality. So if we accept Bell correlations according to which there are non-trivial relationships between states of affairs in spatially distant locations, then it cannot be the case that everything supervenes on local, purely local matters of fact. So this is a well-trodden path, and we're not going to pursue this. I'm just going to say that whatever the verdict of this debate may be, let us grant that the Humean can respond to the challenge. Maybe they will have to extend their supervenience space to include non-local facts, or they have to do some sort of other move. But it's not the problem I'm interested in today. Now, although a purely local arrangement of facts would have been attractive for a Humean, of course, extending it to accommodate quantum non-locality seems not in violation of the Humean spirit of forbidding necessary connections. So maybe that was a problem of locality, but locality doesn't necessarily seem to be a problem for to rule out necessary connections. Of course, it means that the distinct entities, the separate things which exist, which are not supposed to stand in necessary connections, cannot be sort of purely spatially isolated then. So that's the sense in which it would have been attractive for a Humean to do it by using just local facts. That's not going to be possible. But let's grant, at least for the time being, that there is a response available to the Humean. But now when we move to quantum gravity, we face a deeper challenge than that from quantum non-locality. If the world is fundamentally non-spatiotemporal, then what it means to be a spatiotemporal arrangement doesn't even seem to be statable. So nothing like the supervenience space that's been offered by Lewis, for instance, is going to be, could serve the purpose of the fundamental set, the basis. So that means the mosaic or the carpet metaphors in the set of basic occurrent facts must be given up, because it's a mosaic is a spatiotemporal arrangement of local matters of fact. That's why it was such a useful metaphor for Lewis. Maybe a carpet is a little bit different. A mosaic seems to be at least sort of spatially, right? The different colored tiles are in fixed places on some sort of fixed background. They're attached to that. Now, a carpet maybe isn't like that. Maybe a carpet is sort of not on any fixed background. It's more like it's a general relativistic space-time. There's more sort of freedom of motion, of states, of configurations of the carpet, but nevertheless, it seems to be a sort of a spatiotemporal fabric in some sense, connected into a whole. Okay, good. So these metaphors are not going to be useful anymore, even if that mosaic or carpet or whatever is includes non-local facts. The supervenience space can't be articulated in any spatiotemporal terms at all. Now, does this imply that there cannot be a way to express a humanly acceptable set of non-nomic facts that could serve as a supervenience space? Now, I don't think so. I don't think that this in itself implies that, but it means that we have to radically reconceptualize how such an approach would work. In other words, can we still have some sort of a Humean carpet or something even looser than that, even if not a Humean mosaic? Now, we will need what I'm going to be calling glue. Namely, we have to have some relations which unify a world. And for a world to be unified, the particular contingent facts also require some form of weave or glue in the supervenience space to turn them into a world. Now, of course, spatiotemporal relations do this for Lewis, and these are no longer available. Now, what kind of relations could we use? Could we take over this weaving or gluing? Could you do this job? Now, arguably, these relations should be appropriately external, so that they wouldn't connect the particular facts in a matter of necessity somehow. There would be, whether or not two distinct entities stand in or not, that relation is a matter of contingent circumstance. Okay, now I also I haven't introduced the idea of naturalism, but I think it's an idea fairly natural, I dare say, to most people in the audience. It's the idea that we should pay close attention to our the best empirical sciences for our philosophizing about the world. Now, if you are such a naturalist and you look to the sciences, then of course, what these relations are is not something that can be somehow, and this is the problem with what Lewis tried, fixed once and for all in an a priori way prior to any science. In fact, it's going to be an a posteriori matter. Okay, now what a new supervenience space for the naturalistic Humean project approach to quantum gravity, of course. So this is not something that's already decided, and in that sense, it certainly stays open until we have a sort of an established quantum theory of gravity. Now, what this theory will be will in turn depend on what these approaches take. The relations we're going to end up with and the supervenience space in general will depend on what these approaches take to be their current facts and what connects them. So we have to look at what these theories postulate as the fundamental ontology in a way, and ideology in the Quinean sense. That is, by virtue of what do they exist in the same world as the spatiotemporal relations in charge of that task no longer offer that duty. These connections ought to be assured by external relations and cannot in any way be nomic or modal, of course, because otherwise we would include necessary connections again. So in a slogan form, what we need is some form of glue, some sort of relations which puts together, patches together the world, which unifies something and maybe isolates it from other worlds, but is not nomically charged. It doesn't somehow encode necessary connections between the distinct entities. That's going to be the challenge, and that's going to be the challenge on which I think this will be, the Humeanism, the naturalist Humanism, I should say, is going to be, faltering, I think. Anyway, so here are two examples of current facts. If you look at two theories of quantum gravity, just to give you an example, loop quantum gravity and causal sets theory. Very roughly speaking, according to loop quantum gravity, what there is are something like spin network states. So that's the structures consisting of these combinatorial or algebraic degrees of freedom which connect in certain ways to form large structures. According to causal set theory, of course, what there is fundamentally are causal sets, which are elementary events, fundamental events, which are not further distinguished, and they stand in causal relations, which are essentially partially ordering these fundamental events. In either case, the laws are going to be the axioms or theorems of these theories which describe these structures. So it's going to be the laws of loop quantum gravity or the laws of causal set theory, of course. Okay. Now, having some of these examples in mind, let's consider whether any of that is going to be able to give us the glue without the nomic charge. So what guarantees that the facts in this basic sets in the supervenience space are non-modal or non-nomic? Now, this is a very important point. Traditionally, for a Humean of the kind of Lewis, for instance, this is done by a principle of free recombination. So if you take the basic elements, they can be recombined in any way whatsoever. They can be recombined freely without restriction. And that's what ensures that there's nothing like a necessary connection between these fundamental entities. So a principle of free recombination is a principle according to which elementary entities such as facts or states of affairs are freely recombinable, and any combination or permutation of them generates a metaphysically possible world. And this is what guarantees, as I already said, the non-nomicity of the supervenience basis. Now, generally, of course, philosophers, analytic metaphysicians do this pre-theoretically. So they do this prior to looking at any scientific theory. But of course, if you're a naturalist, that is exactly the problem. That's why so many of these proposals have gone wrong or have had to be, given up sooner or later because they just didn't really preconceive the ways in which science is going to move away from these conceptions. Okay, so if a naturalist looks to quantum gravity theories, guide us as to what these basic facts are and permissible combinations thereof. It's causal set theory or loop quantum gravity or string theory or some other approach to quantum gravity that's going to tell us what are the ways in which the elementary elements, the nodes in the spin network, the strings in a string theoretic approach, the elementary events in a causal set theory, and so on and so forth, are going to be combinable. But of course, that's already applying laws of nature, namely the laws of nature according to that theory. Any such base is already nomically charged. So the problem in one slide is that in those theories, facts are not really freely recombinable. They're only combinable in ways permitted by these theories. Those theories we, as naturalists, wanted to take seriously. But to invoke a theory, to license the ways in which these elementary existence can be recombined amounts precisely to imposing something like laws on these basic facts and in some sense necessary connections. They may not be metaphysically necessary connections, of course, but they would be in some sense physically or nomically necessary connections. So that's the problem. If you want to be a naturalistic Humean, then you have to you have to somehow navigate the following tension. You have, from your naturalism, something like the theoretical possibilities given to you, but those are already nomically charged. They're not nomically innocent. They already come in the background in some way or other with some laws of nature. But as a Humean, you wanted absolutely no necessary connections among the particular facts in your supervenience space. And that's the tension you have to navigate somehow. Now, maybe this means we can still be naturalistic Humeans. We cannot just be maximally naturalistic while at the same time maximally Humean. So maybe there has to be some sort of trade-off that needs to be negotiated. Or maybe we just give up one particular part of the combination of these two positions. Okay, let's continue. And maybe to rephrase the same point once again, it's just to say that it seems as if the Humean must reject that it is those theories which underwrite the non-nomicity of the supervenience set, but that seems almost like a self-defeating circularity. So you reject the theories, the connections governed by the theory that you used to establish your, supervenience base. So the naturalist Humean finds herself in the awkward position of accepting what our best fundamental theories tell us. What binds particular matters of fact, what I called the glue, to get what unifies and isolates worlds, without accepting the theory fully, which is trying to avoid the nomic voltage, of course. So is there any hope that this tension can somehow be navigated? Now, I'm going to discuss two different proposals in which maybe we could try to come up with a compromise between the two things, if we want to maintain some level of Humanism anyway. And one is that we could distinguish between the kinematic aspects of a theory and the dynamic ones. So we could take the kinematically possible models, which in some much looser sense tell us what the possible ways are in which things can be. You just say, what kind of objects do we have? What kind of structures do we have? And very generally, without imposing any dynamical laws, how these can combine to form possibilities, genuine physically possible world according to these theories. So that would give us the glue. That would tell us what a world is. And because we don't impose yet the dynamical equations, the dynamical laws, then those which more generally are metaphysical possibilities, those which are physical or nomical possibilities would then not yet be identified, and that would be avoiding the nomic voltage, as it were, of imposing some laws already. Now, this is certainly an approach. I'm running out of time. I'm not going to say anything more, but this would be pleasing to the naturalist because we look directly to the structure of not just quantum theories of gravity, but what is a very generic feature, it seems, of many, many, many physical theories. Probably not all of physical theories, but many physical theories offer such a distinction, and as such, that might be helpful. But there are some problems with this approach, I think, and I'm going to mention 3 problems. Essentially, they're problems of being too naturalistic, or maybe not in some sense. So first of all, we presuppose that there is a natural distinction between kinematics and dynamics of a theory. But it's not obvious that this distinction really remains meaningful in the context of quantum gravity, in particular in a context where it's not so clear whether we have a spatiotemporal background that we normally presuppose when we talk of dynamics. So this is a distinction that we first have to establish can be maintained in those quantum theories of gravity that we're interested in. And in some sense, maybe it can, but let the fact that physicists continue to use these words fool you that this is really the kind of right distinction that would be needed for such a project. So there needs to be some work, at least, to establish that this is that there is such a distinction that could be made to work for the purposes for the present purposes. Secondly, there's a sense in which it may be too naturalistic because in a way it may stay too close to a particular physical theory, or at least a framework of theories, and it's going to be ruling out many other possibilities. So you really already, even though it's just at the kinematical level, you already have to commit to a theoretical framework. And in other words, you rule out anything that, according to that theoretical framework, is not a genuine physical possibility. So all of this will be gone. So in a way, this is shares some of the problems of Alistair Wilson's quantum modal realism, for instance, that rules out many things which are not considered by the theory, which are not possibilities according to the one theory that you're looking at. And it may still be insufficiently Humean. To what extent, you could ask, can we still say that the kinematic possibilities are not nomically charged, even though we haven't imposed the dynamical laws, which are the sort of constraints that are often called laws by physicists? It's still the case that already the kinematic structure of a theory encodes what is part, I think, of the nomological structure of a theory. So it's not clear that this is really fully going to avoid the problem of necessary connections. But maybe that is the way, the compromise the Humean has to make, that there's just not going to be a way in which you could maintain full-blown Humanism. Okay, here's another idea. Maybe the problem was right in the beginning, that we were sort of too much thinking of the physical state and the state of affairs in physical space, and then having some sort of evolution of some sort of temporal dynamical laws governing that. We were already sort of too much married to that picture perhaps in the first place. We should abstract away from that and look at something like state space or configuration spaces of fundamental theories rather than at physical states. And it looks like the kind of theories in quantum gravity that we have, they have some kind of state space or configuration space or Hilbert space or some space like that that's going to let us say what the general space of possibilities are going to be. since these theories will be quantum theories, you could have a configuration space or a Hilbert space, which can be assumed as fundamental, for instance. Okay, now that would be using, in a sense, a completely different space as the foundation for the Humean supervenience space. Now, I think this is an interesting and promising proposal, but there are some problems. There's at least some things that would need to be navigated by a defender of this approach before it's a viable option, I think. And I'm going to mention two challenges that would have to be met. The first one is it does seem to presuppose a specific space, but each system has its own state or Hilbert space. So when you fix a Hilbert space, for instance, you fix already the complexity in some sense, the degrees of freedom that you could have. You could not add more degrees of freedom or maybe subtract is something you could, but you can't add degrees of freedom. So there's a sense in which you're quite restricted in the sense that you're committed to say how many degrees of freedom there are fundamentally, and there's a sense in which then there couldn't have been any other number of degrees of freedom or something like that. And that would certainly be an undesirable outcome, I think, even for a physicist or a naturalistic philosopher. So maybe we have to generalize that in a way that we would be looking at something like a state in a state space or Hilbert space, which itself then is in a bigger space of different state spaces or Hilbert spaces that would be giving us the full sort of range of metaphysical possibilities. Okay, now even if there's a way to generalize this so that we could resolve this first problem, it would still make free recombination somewhat hostage to the particular theory, of course, or family of theories that we're looking at. Because in setting up whatever that space or space of spaces is going to be, we're of course presupposing, again, at least parts or fragments of a theory. And I think this is just something that cannot be avoided at all if we're going to be truly naturalists here. So there's a sense in which we cannot have completely, entirely, freely recombinable a posteriori entities which are going to sort of span the full range of metaphysical possibilities. Okay, let me conclude. I hope I'm not too much over time. Let me conclude just one slide of general conclusions and then one slide of more specific conclusions for Humeanism. As I said at the beginning, I really only presented one part of the project with Vincent, which is the part concerning Humanism. But of course, there are other approaches to laws of nature, and part of the project is also to study the implications for those other approaches, in particular, as I told you, for primitivism and dispositionalism. Okay. Now, the tentative result that spacetime disappears, it is tentative right now, of course, at the fundamental level would, if borne out, force radical reconceptions of what it is to be a law of nature. So that's a conclusion very much in line with Nick's conclusions last week. This would be the case for all three approaches. So I'm asserting this here without having given you any reason to think that it's also going to be the case for the other two approaches. I understand that, but that's the general conclusion of our project. Because in one way or another, they all presuppose fundamental spacetime. And for all of them, there is the very central question of what could take the place of spacetime or of spatiotemporal relations if those are not fundamental, if spacetime only emerges contingently. In fact, the required revisions seem to be so sweeping that it opens the question of whether the approaches would survive into the new era, or whether an altogether different way of thinking about laws of nature would actually be needed. I mean, this is a sort of open-ended conclusion, but it does raise quite radical questions, we believe. Okay, as for Humeanism, I think if physics really will turn out to be non-spatiotemporal in some interesting sense, would deprive the Humean of a natural supervenience space on which to apply some form of free recombination to generate the metaphysical possibilities devoid of the necessary connections that the Humean, of course, wants to insist on. This points to a general tension between Humanism about laws and naturalism. I believe that there's a sense in which this point is quite generalizable and not so much depending on quantum gravity or the absence of space and time. If we want to be naturalists and if we want to take fundamental physics seriously, we're always going to have to face the tension between getting some sort of freely recombinable but gluing relations, some relations which we can identify as the truly fundamental ones, which has to be a search governed by fundamental physics as a naturalist, which at the same time is sufficiently Humean in the sense that there's really no hint of necessity in those connections, in those relations that we admit. So that's, I think, the central tension for a humanist, a Humean who wants to be a naturalist, or the other way around. Okay, now, maybe one conclusion is that this is just impossible. We may not be able to look to scientific reasoning while suppressing how it projects necessity or nomicity into the world, because scientific theorizing is about, in a way, projecting nomically necessary connections into the world. That's what theorizing is by its very nature. So, you know, the tension may be non-navigable at all at the end. Of course, I believe that when push comes to shove, and we can debate that, I haven't argued this, but I think we should remember that Humanism is an optional, nice to have, elegant metaphysical framework, but naturalism is really mandatory and not negotiable in that sense. So thank you very much.
I'll clap for everybody, I think. So thank you very much. Hi, okay, everyone. Thanks, Zoom. So here's how I just sent a message in the chat about this. So the first thing to try, if you have a question, please, is to put your name in the Q&A. You should see a button that says Q&A, and I have a queue there. And you can see there, you know, how long the queue is. I'll generally stick to the order that's there, but I might jump around a little bit from time to time. Please put your name there. When I call on you, you'll get speaking privileges. And I'm going to try making it so you have camera privileges as well, so Chris can see you. If that takes too long, I might just give people just the microphone privileges. If you can't speak, you know, you don't have a mic or something, you can post a question in chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, and maybe Chris can too, and pick up some questions that come there. Okay, well, I'm going to...
Maybe I should start by saying that I'm very sorry, but I find it terribly difficult to speak and or respond to a question and at the same time read the chat. So please forgive me if that doesn't work.
Yes. Okay, so first up we have David Bergman. Go ahead, David.
Hello?
Hi.
Okay, so you can hear me. Okay. When you gave me privileges, it booted me out and then had me rejoin. So things needed to be set. Thank you. It was a wonderful talk, and thank you for accepting my question. I apologize for violating your protocol more than once. I
didn't notice.
The questions that I had really, you kind of addressed them as you approached the end of your talk. And from a physical point of view, it just seems to me that, and it has seemed to me for decades, that if we accept quantum mechanics, the postulates of quantum mechanics and the Copenhagen interpretation as a foundation for how we do physics and approach interpreting observations, that everything we have observed about, everything we say about space and time is based on our bodies are detecting features of space and time through measurement, and that is an inherently classical process. So it would seem like you just simply cannot impose a priori anything, even a topology. I even wonder if open set topology will survive as a feature of space and time, or if that has to emerge. And when you first started talking about the Aristotelian criterion, I'm curious about two things. Whether or not that can survive in a more abstract sense, like by accepting that Hilbert space as a foundational feature of how we view reality, or if it even needs to survive. And my second question, since I'm not a philosopher, I felt like I felt like several times it was said or implied that at least in some paradigm, the existence of spatial temporal relations is somewhat necessary for existence, at least from some point of view. And I'd be curious to know, if I have not misinterpreted that, where I might read about that and what logical arguments may have been, presented over history to support that paradigm.
Oh, the Aristotelian paradigm that to exist is to exist in space and time?
Yes. And that might be true, yeah, but it's only true classically. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Philosophers have certainly debated this from many different angles to start with your second question first. So there's the question, of course, would that rule out abstract entities? Would it rule out the existence of gods? Would it rule out the existence of mental entities? All sorts of, questions have come up as a result of that over the course of the centuries of philosophizing. So you could go anywhere in philosophy and find ways in which the debates relate to that point. If you're more interested specifically in space and time, Nick and I in various work have discussed this point in some way or another. And our view, maybe I should speak for me, but my view is that work in quantum gravity suggests that maybe we have to generalize this or revise the criterion, at least insofar as we do not require the fundamental existence of space and time. Maybe we can require that space-time arises, emerges in some sense, contingently, that our world is one of those worlds in which this is in fact happening, but it's clear that this criterion has to be generalized. As for your first question, so I'm not an advocate of the Copenhagen interpretation, mostly because I'm not sure I fully understand it, or it's sort of sufficiently precise for my viewpoint. One thing that could be said, but maybe abstracting away from interpretation of quantum mechanics, is that, of course, qua human beings, we experience the world in spatiotemporal ways. That's undoubtedly the case. I mean, it's not just for the Copenhagen interpretation and how we have measurement outcomes somehow, but quite generally our empirical access, the world manifests itself to us in a spatiotemporal order. So whatever the fundamental theory is going to be, it will have to recover that. Mm-hmm. It will have to explain how, given the fundamental ways the world is, given that, how it could this world can manifest itself to us in ways which order phenomena or entities spatiotemporally. That is absolutely clear. So in that sense, space-time has to emerge, of course, if it's not fundamental, for in those worlds in which human scientists have any empirical access to the world. Okay, I'm not sure of whether that answers your question, but I hope it goes.
It does. I could discuss this for several more hours, but I will give other people a chance to ask questions. I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I have Carl Hegfer up next. And
okay, I think you can hear me now.
Yes, I pressed the wrong button. I was going to make you visible, but I failed.
That's all right. Anyway, thanks, Chris. So nice talk. I guess I don't have a question so much as a comment or suggestion about how to go if you're attracted to a Humean view of laws in general. And it's based on sort of the way I approached the whole question of the mosaic when I wrote my book on chance, offering a Humean account of chance. And I'm not a Humean about laws, but one thing we should remember here is there's a difference between being a Humean in a broad sense and being a David Lewisian. And right. I think that your talk was really focusing on being a David Lewisian. And more broadly, a Humean type empiricist wants to say that laws are about systematizing what we see, what we can see out there in the world, and what's empirically accessible to us. And that is still there. And that's still describable at many different ontological levels. And we don't have to just throw away everything except some fundamental level when we start thinking about how to systematize. And in fact, we stay closer to the practice of science if we remember that we want what we're trying to systematize is everything that we see and experience. And then you could say, well, I still have the Humean mosaic. It's the mosaic of evidence that we gather, broadly speaking. And then scientific theories are things we cook up to try to make sense of that. And there's no particular problem if one of those theories postulates a basis, which is non-spatiotemporal, as long as it does that job you were just describing, of giving us back the world at the right level of at some point in the story. So that was the suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's a great suggestion. Of course, we should distinguish, Humanism from Lewisianism. I completely agree about that, even though sometimes, Lewis is such a dominant influence that it sometimes gets a little bit forgotten. So thank you very much for reminding us about that. So I certainly agree that there are very specific problems in the Lewisian metaphysics that come up, the ones I've suggested. And they may not come up, or at least in the same way, for a different Humean approach. I certainly agree that the laws for a Humean are something like systematizing our evidence, what we have, and as such, we could sort of, as a starting point, as an empiricist starting point, we should take the manifold of evidence and to explain that. And that's certainly something that is very close to the scientific practice. There is just a question of what we, let me just add one more thing. I'm not convinced that this completely takes care of all problems, because the question then is, how do we characterize that mosaic of evidence? What is the manifold or mosaic or what have you of evidence? What is evidence in the first place? If that has any spatiotemporal connotations, what does that suggest of if our best physics would tell us that it's possible that fundamental physical existence combine in ways such that no space-time will emerge. So that question still remains, and whether that's, an approach would maintain coherence. under that in that case, I suppose. But you're right. The problem is not exactly the same for different approaches to Humanism. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Carl. The next question is from Ryan Miller, who should be just appearing as a panelist any second now. Ryan, go ahead.
Hi, Chris. My concern is about how new this recombination problem is for quantum gravity for the Humean as opposed to earlier theories. So I'm thinking of two examples. One is, say, the Humean is looking at a Newtonian picture of the world, and so what we have are, corpuscles with, real valued masses or something like that. And so then we formulate a best systems account that gives us, the law of gravity or whatever. But mass, it seems to me, is in a way really defined by, F equals ma. And so if we do an experiment where we put, two differently, or we imagine an experiment where two differently massed particles are exposed to the same distances from other particles, and they're the same in all ways other than mass, they have the same charge, whatever, and we see that they have different accelerations. I wonder if that's just impossible, in a way that our choice of the objects in the world constrain the modality. Or for another simple toy example, think about a theory that tells us what there are continuous space-time, spatiotemporal fields. That's the fundamental reality of our theory. But now, if we fix one point of the field, then we can't arbitrarily recombine what else is in our reality without violating the continuity assumption, which was part of our definition of what existed.
Yes, thank you. I certainly agree that in a way it's a much more general problem, and a problem that could be articulated in non-quantum gravitational contexts. I completely agree about that. And I try to say that, sort of working my way towards that conclusion. I think that was not a priori clear when we tried to approach the problem that a Humean has who wants to naturalistically take seriously quantum gravity. And, a problem that's very specific about space-time may then become much more general in a way, as you rightly describe. And that raises the general question, how do we negotiate naturalism and Humanism? Of course, we would want to do that in some way, because as Carl has rightly said, in a way, the empiricist Humean sort of approach to understanding metaphysics is something that one would think is very, very close to scientific approach to understanding the world. So in that sense, it would have to be compatible at some level, but maybe it would require that we really reconceptualize Humanism in general, and sort of free it from the way that David Lewis in particular has thought about it.
Okay, great. The next question is from Carlo Ravelli.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, it just disappeared. Chris, thank you very much. This I love.
Yeah.
This.
By the way, sorry. When I call on people, I will change people from being an attendee to a panelist, and you'll momentarily feel you've been kicked out, but you'll appear again automatically on the panel. I guess it's like standing up from the audience and walking up to the table at the front.
Yes, but it's panicking. The moment you're called, you disappeared, and then you come back. So don't worry for the next one. Chris, thank you very much. I love this talk. I mean, I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. It really got to the core of questions I'm asking myself. So I want to comment on what you said and get to a question which resonates a lot with previous comments in the direction. Somehow, can we save a weaker version of Hume without going to Lewis in some form? Which you arrived at. You didn't arrive to a strong position. You sort of hinted what you think without. Seems to me putting a very very strong arrival point. What I would say is this. I'm a physicist, I'm not a philosopher, but I read The Plurality of Worlds and by Lewis, and I was totally fascinated by it. In fact, I was conquered by it. I started with all sorts of negative prejudices, and then Lewis is just amazing, except to one point. There's one point in which I said, wait a minute, this doesn't fit with my physics. And that's exactly the point you're referring to. When he tries to define what he means by a world, a single word, he uses a space-time characterization that in my physics just don't hold. So, but for two reasons. One reason is quantum mechanics. And there was already a question about that. But I ended up thinking that no, it's still compatible with quantum mechanics. Not really if you take a Copenhagen interpretation, which in a sense pushes you toward empiricism, which is Van Frassen, is not Lewis. But if you take, say, a Bohmian pilot wave, then you can have the mosaic, and everything works exactly in the Lewis account. Now, if you go to general relativity, on the other hand, it becomes a little more tricky. And you said so when you talked about the carpet versus the mosaic. So Lewis' picture is really the mosaic, it's not the carpet. Namely, there are points there, there are things, you put the yellow here and blue there, or vice versa. Now, you cannot do that in general relativity, which is really a carpet, unless you do something like modeling, but I think it's not GR that, it's wrong, in my opinion. So you can still save a Lewis perspective, but it's really pushing already in general relativity, in classical general relativity, because you don't have a priori space-time with properties here and there. In a sense, the point are defined by the properties in a much more relational view that what at least a simple reading of Lewis would allow. All right, but you can still say that. But when you put the two together, you really are in trouble. And I don't want to redo your talk, but you're totally right. You're really in trouble. So then at the end, you say, okay, so naturalism is non-negotiable. Does this really forces us to give up humanism all the way through, including the idea that laws express necessity, nomicity? I would very much like to resist that. Still having everything you said, at the very last moment, wait a minute, can't we still think, after correcting for GR, correcting for quantum mechanics, can't we still think that this, and you were going in that direction, separate kinematics from dynamics. The world is a set of events. The things that happen. And it's a collection of all possible worlds are all collection of all possible events. So one can still be Now, I understand your question about glue very well. But I'm not offering a position, a solution, but I wish and I think that there should be a solution. Namely, I can still think as one word as an ensemble of events that has happened, will happen historically, and the laws as the best system description of the relation between this, such that allows us to say that given this happened, then we expect that will happen with a certain probability.
Right. I mean, it's. I'm not sure I see a question there. I agree with pretty much everything you say. I feel the same way. I certainly. So let me, revisit a couple of points you said. First of all, I agree with you that I think sort of the Lewisian view, as fascinating as it is and as well written, the book is, really already is arguably in tension with GR. So already for incorporating GR, we have to relax the way Lewis thinks about these worlds a little bit. But, perhaps this can be done, I think, with a little twist here and there. This can be done. And the same for quantum mechanics with the sort of problems you get there. You have the problem of non-locality that's certainly not consistent with the way that Lewis formulates Humean supervenience, but maybe we can reasonably sort of generalize the idea so that it's compatible with quantum mechanics. But you're quite right. Once we put the two together, the challenge goes up to the next level. Can we formulate it at that level? I'm not sure. I feel the same as you. I would like to do that, because I think that a Humean approach to metaphysics really is, as Carl rightly said, it's very sort of a consonant to the way to a scientific approach to understanding the world as it manifests itself to us. So the two should go together, but that means we really have to move away from the way Lewis, at least, was conceptualizing the Humean approach and sort of generalize that. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so next question is from Robert Reiner-Sewitz. You have a mic, you have a camera. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I have a number of challenging questions, but the one that's most urgent for me is really just a question of clarification about the best systems account of laws. So I take it the way this goes is you start off with all of the facts in the world, and then you can write down all of the sentences that are true of the world. And then what you want to do with this balance of informative and simplicity is arrive at a certain subset of that complete description. Am I so far on target?
It doesn't necessarily need to be a subset, but you need to formulate, if you want to talk at the level of propositions, you need to formulate proposition sentences which express somehow or describe the regularities in the ground level facts, in the particular facts that you've captured with the first set of sentences.
Yeah, well, but I take it that's the best system then.
Yes.
That what you do is you take some subset of everything that's true from which you can, well, you can't derive the whole rest because you may need initial conditions and so on. But then in the best system, I take it that every proposition is nomically necessary.
So do you mean every true proposition at the world?
Every true proposition in the best system is nomically necessary.
In the sense that it has to be true in all the worlds with the same laws?
That's right. I mean, well, it would be true in all. Well, we don't have an accessibility relation in order to isolate the set of physically possible worlds, but the best system would then be the device that tells us what worlds are physically possible relative to ours.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, there's a sense in which a true proposition at our world isn't nomically necessary in general, because it could be the case that it would have been false, but the best system would still have been the same. Because there could be, of course, a difference in the supervenience space without there being a change, concordant or corresponding change at the level of the laws. But
okay,
you're right. Given the laws, that gives us the set of worlds which are nomically, which have the same laws. Yes.
Right. Well, what I really want to know is, are there any nomically necessary propositions that are not physical laws?
You mean something like mathematical propositions, maybe, or?
Well, I guess you might have to worry about that and just simply logical truths being physically necessary. I mean, they're going to be true in all physically possible worlds, right?
Yeah.
But I take it that's not a terrible consequence.
Yeah, that's probably a consequence you would have to accept, yes.
Yeah, but I want to know whether there are nomically possible propositions that are not themselves laws. I mean, you were talking about axioms, and I was talking to somebody the other day that thought that, well, what you get is the set of nomically possible, the nomically necessary truths, and then you have to axiomatize that in order to find out what the laws are. And so what you do is you take the simplest axiomatization, or at least that was this person's proposal. And it didn't seem to me that we should say that there are nomically necessary propositions that are not physical laws. And I'm just wondering what the original account says about this.
So if I can butt in, I'm pretty sure Lewis says every logical consequence of the best system is that the laws are everything that's a logical consequence of the best system.
Okay, great. Thank you, then.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is why I wrote axiom or theorem. So that's what I mean by
right,
theorem.
Okay. Yeah. Great, then. All right, thanks very much.
But it does presuppose, I suppose, a logic and, with sort of connections of, what does it mean to have a deductively closed system and things like this, of course.
Okay, so now I can ask challenging questions like, what is a degree of freedom? Okay, never mind.
Oh.
Never mind. Go on with other questioners.
Yeah,
that is a very challenging question, and in fact, a question which I think may not be sort of, theory independent, as it were. What is a degree of freedom? Yeah. Anyway, Rob has gone.
And next we have, Siddharth Muthukrishnan. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Actually, so the question that I wanted to ask was essentially asked by Carlo Robelli. So maybe I'll ask a different question, but it might not be as well formed as the one that I had in mind, so apologies. So the my question is, so you said that, so you're mostly sort of pointing out problems with Humeanism, but then you also pointed out that both primitivism and dispositionalism make use of spatiotemporal, refer to spatiotemporal properties in order to sort of get themselves off the ground. But I'm curious about whether you can say something about whether those approaches are more able to avoid this necessary appeal to spatiotemporal properties. So, for example, perhaps if you're a primitivist, you can sort of just, since you take the laws to make primitive anyway, you can try to just, instead of have the degrees of freedom evolve in space-time after some initial specification, you can have them evolve in a Hilbert space or whatever mathematical spatial structure that you have. So it seems like primitivism might do better at these kinds of challenges than, say, Humanism.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. I haven't really talked about this, but the very general idea of primitivism, I think, is perfectly independent of space-time, I think. But that's a very, very general level. As soon as you start to look at any more specific formulation of how we're supposed to be thinking of that theory, then, it's steeped in spatiotemporal locutions. Usually the idea is something like, well, why do we have laws? Because we don't want to just sort of primitively postulate all the particular facts of the world. I mean, that's not theorizing in any way. You just say, well, the world is what it is, the set of everything that is the case, or then we could become a Wittgensteinian maybe or something. But if that's not the goal, if you're trying to find a way of theorizing about the world, you want to say, well, I'm not going to need all the things that the Humean needs in the, in the four-dimensional mosaic of all particular matters of fact. What I'm going to need is only some sort of configuration, spatial configuration of the total system of the world and the dynamical laws of how this is going to evolve over time. Now, that evolution may be deterministic or indeterministic, depending on what the best physical theory tells us. But that's really, the way we can best theorize about the world. Now, obviously, that's not going to be working anymore. So the question then becomes, how can the primitivists sort of say, identify some sort of subset of all particular matters of fact, perhaps, and some sort of other relations which sort of let them project that limited set to the totality of existence. So somehow allow inferences, perhaps probabilistic inferences, from that sort of more minimal basis to the totality of existence. How can we make, and laws being those things which allow us to do the projecting, of course. So how can we characterize the fundamental sort of subset of facts that we're going to identify at our or include at our fundamental level, and then how are we going to think about the laws, which are those things which project these to be, total, to create or span total worlds out of this. And you're right. And what you do as a naturalist, you look at the physical theories and try to understand how the physical theory does that, and maybe that will tell you how you should think about it. I'm definitely not saying this is impossible, and maybe the tension there is much less pronounced. But nevertheless, it's what we think right now, without having completed the project, is that it's going to be one conclusion of the project is that also the primitivist and dispositionalist accounts will have to be reconceptualized quite radically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Might help if you can hear me. Mike, go ahead.
Oh, great. Right. So to the extent that I'm at all familiar with the sort of background constellation of issues here, I'm immensely content with the kind of pressure you're putting on this dual wielding of naturalism and humanism in this way. What I wanted to ask is to try to maybe tease out a positive thesis with regards to the naturalism part of that dual wielding that I think is coming up in various ways in this Q&A session. And so am I to understand the naturalist view as the view from within the physics camp? Or is this a philosopher's naturalist view that has surveyed the various domains of science and recognized that there's something distinctive, say, about the methods or the content or aims of physics among them that is supposed to give us the fundamental stuff that's going to be relevant?
Okay, I mean, that's a good question, a fair question. It's not a question I have thought much about it in the context of this project. In the context of this project, the naturalist is just somebody looking at fundamental physics, really, and recognizing that GR and the standard model of particle physics is not fundamental simpliciter, that there's going to be some theories beyond these currently best theories, and looking at approaches to that to these theories. That's the naturalist I have in mind. I believe this is a respectable form of naturalism, but there may be other forms, and maybe if we're a naturalist taking into account other sciences, of course, then this might look different.
And so do you, I guess, do you anticipate, in broad strokes, not having a few different views of naturalism on the table? So this is a general question, I guess. But do you anticipate that whether there is going to be a middle ground to carve out between humanism and naturalism is going to be sensitive to that? Or is your hunch that, I mean, the last line in your final slide, that you're going to say there's something important about the naturalism that we need to hold on to that isn't the case for a Humean view as opposed to, say, a more modally rich view? So I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of how physics dependent is the naturalism in that line.
I don't know how physics dependent it is in that final line, but of course, a naturalist who's not looking to fundamental physics may not get into the kind of trouble that I described in the first place. So if you're a naturalist, but by the way you understand naturalism, you're going to exclude certainly quantum gravity and maybe, other, what we consider fundamental physics right now, such as GR and, the standard model of particle physics or something like that, then I don't think you necessarily have the kind of problem that I describe. So whatever form of naturalism it is, it has to be a form which, for one reason or other, gives central stage to fundamental physics. Without that, I think the problem does not arise, or at least not in the form I described.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay. We really have to finish at 11, I think, or 11 my time, whatever time it is. Yeah, we're in 10 minutes. I have 5 questions. So to the extent possible, let's everyone keep these quick. Though maybe, we'll finish at 11. Maybe if Chris can stay around for a couple of minutes, if there's anybody else to finish up. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting. So I just had a comment about one of your slides, and then maybe if you sense there's a problem as I do, I have a recommendation for a fix. So the slide where you say, under the supposition that quantum theories of gravity are correct in their implication that space-time is not fundamental, Lewis's pluriverse, for all its ontological abundance, does not contain our actual world or our world. And you say on Lewis's account of modality, our world comes out as metaphysically impossible. So it was, insofar as you're interested in Lewis and Lewis's humanism, it's my understanding that Lewis maintained that humanism, indeed humanism about laws, was a metaphysically contingent thesis. And so, there could be worlds at which you have all else, and the all else doesn't globally supervene on the local matters of particular fact, these categorical, qualitative, so on and so forth, kinds of intrinsic properties arranged in some way in a space-time. He just, his reason for that was, he thought there could be these alien properties and alien dispositions which were kind of weird and strange and not built up out of Boolean operations from anything at our world. And that therefore his thesis could fail at some possible world. So it wouldn't be metaphysically impossible. Such a world wouldn't be metaphysically impossible for Lewis. So that's like the complaint.
Okay, let me pull up the slide again so that everybody can see.
Page 12 or slide 12, I think.
Okay, no, that's not. Sorry. I think it should be this one, maybe.
Yes.
Right? Okay, good. Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, I mean, I'm not a Lewis, interpreter, I should add here. And this really concerns a different paper. As you can see the reference here that I wrote, it's not the present project. But you're quite right in saying that Lewis had reasons to think that Humean supervenience itself is not a necessary truth. It's a contingent truth. But that doesn't, or I don't see at least how it touches the point I made here in this paper. Here the idea is that on plurality of worlds, Lewis talks about what identifies or what unifies and isolates a possible world from other possible worlds. And that is something that's necessary in the sense that it applies to all possible worlds. I mean, it's like the vantage point from which you build any possible worlds. And for him, these are spatiotemporal relations, of course, which do that job. And he discusses, in one section, he discusses generalizations of these spatiotemporal relations, various ways in which you might want to generalize those. And in this paper, which is an argument I didn't go over today, but in this paper, I argue that even with these generalizations, according to this Lewisian picture, some of the worlds that come out as physically possible ways the world could be in some quantum theories of gravity would not qualify as metaphysically possible because they do not, they're not unified in any way by these generalized spatiotemporal external relations. And that's a problem for Lewis because, you know, it seems then if our actual world is like this, then, you know, it's not metaphysically possible. And that seems to be an unwanted conclusion.
Just one quick thing. I know we are running out of time and there are a couple people in the queue, but just one quick thing. You might, Lewis can say, hey, this is a way we might think about individuating or discerning worlds from worlds. And these could just be, he could just show an interest in derivative facts about those worlds and differentiate the worlds by means of an appeal to derivative facts about those worlds, because differences in derivative facts about the relevant worlds are enough to get you differences between worlds. They would have different big conjunctions of facts true at those relevant worlds, and that's enough to get you a difference between those worlds. You need not appeal to what's fundamental about those worlds to discern a difference between the worlds. So it seems to me that one has to say something about, that's the point I want to make in response to that. I'm just curious what your response is.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Fair enough, absolutely. It's something that at least a version of that question or issue I actually consider in this paper. So I really invite you to read it, of course. But so that move seems to work for our world and for many worlds like our world, which are at least at some sort of derivative level spatiotemporal. It would still be the case that there would be worlds in which there's no such derivative spatiotemporal level, no way in which space-time emerges, which would, according to our best physics, be considered physically possible, but according to this Lewisian picture, be considered metaphysically impossible. And that might still be an unwanted conclusion, even though I agree that would be a much milder conclusion.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And David Wallace is up with a question next. David Wallace and Amazing Juggling Baby.
Thank you. Yeah, and in fact, but I think I still asked the question. I was wondering about ADS-CFT in this context. I mean, conjecturing that you had something like an ADS-CFT duality that you could think about cosmologically rather than just for some subsystem. And conjecturing that you want to use the CFT side of that as, if you like, your description of the fundamental degrees of freedom. There's a sense in which theoretically that gives the Humean what they want, in that it's a space-time background over which you've deployed a bunch of particular facts. And yet you kind of feel that those facts are so alien to the kind of ordinary observational space-time facts that the Lewisian Humean supervenist might not thank you for that. So I was wondering what that kind of version of space-time emergence looks like from your analysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have to admit, I haven't thought about this particular case. one thing that strikes me as that, something that would have to be considered by a Humean who would be open to moving in that direction is that, yes, there's a sense in which you could save space-time or something like, reasonably well-behaved space-time in some sense as in your fundamental ontology. But surely if you do that, you already accept quite some theoretical build-up, in some sense, some nomological structure, which tells you that, the ways in which that space-time or the fields in that space-time could be. But maybe, would you then just say that, we just take Minkowski space-time without considering the fields or anything like that as the space-time background then?
Well, that's my sort of thought. In a certain formal sense, if you're looking for a formal quote spatiotemporal surrogate for the various relations and unifying features, then the conformal field theory on the non-dynamical Minkowski background gives all that to you. But in a sense, the very kind of formal clarity of how it gives to you demonstrates, or maybe makes one worry that one needed more than just something with the right formal structure there, because obviously that space-time structure has little or nothing to do with the kind of a current space-time structure that's in the sort of empiricist grounding of Humanism.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. So as you rightly say, prima facie, that would take care of many of the problems, but the question is whether there needs to be some sort of direct connection between that sort of theoretical build-up of how to think about the supervenience space, or the prior to our theorizing about it, and somehow the way we experience the world, the way the world manifests itself to us. And of course, that would be lost in the picture, as you quite rightly say. So maybe, the Humean could then argue and say, but that was not necessary in the first place, But it becomes a bit of a caricature of the position then, I think.
Yes. Almost like careful what you wish for.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think technically we have sort of 30 seconds left, but I think we should probably call it a day. I'm so sorry to Matt Parker, Ding Jia, and you Elowitz. Apologies for that as well. I don't know if Chris has a couple of minutes after to try to talk a little longer with just you three, but I think for everybody else, I should wrap things up now. And once again, just say thanks to Chris for a great talk and a great discussion, and thanks to everybody. Next week, I think it's Francesca Vidotto will be speaking. So I hope to see as many people as possible then as well. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.